The atmosphere in the arena was so thick with tension you could almost taste the impending violence, but before a single punch was thrown, the psychological warfare had already devastated the minds of the spectators. It wasn't just about a fight between two men. It was a clash of ideologies, a collision between the cold, calculated arrogance of an undefeated Russian Sambo machine and the quiet, simmering fire of a Filipino striker who had nothing to lose. The world had tuned in expecting a massacre, a simple exhibition where the predator toyed with its food, because that is exactly what the Russian champion, Dmitri Volkov, had promised them during the press tour. He didn't just say he would win. He laughed at the very idea that a fighter from the slums of Manila could share the same oxygen as him, mocking his height, his poverty, and even his heritage in a display of disrespect that went viral instantly. But as the lights dimmed and the cage door locked, the millions watching worldwide were about to learn a lesson that history has tried to teach tyrants for centuries. You can break a man's bones, but you should never, ever insult his spirit, especially when that spirit carries the weight of an entire nation on its shoulders. To truly understand the shock that rippled through the combat sports community, we have to rewind to the moment the contract was signed, a moment that Volkov treated as a joke rather than a professional obligation. Volkov was a monster of a man, a combat Sambo specialist who had spent his entire life in state-sponsored training facilities, molded by science and brutality into a grappling phenom who tossed opponents around like ragdolls. He had cleared out his division with terrifying ease, often ending fights without a single drop of sweat on his brow, and his arrogance was fueled by a record that contained 0 blemishes. When the matchmakers offered him Gabriel, the Typhoon Magtanggol, a gritty journeyman from the Philippines known more for his heart than his technical ranking, Volkov publicly scoffed, taking to social media to post videos of himself training in a tuxedo, implying that this fight required no serious preparation. This wasn't just confidence. It was a calculated mockery designed to humiliate Gabriel before the opening bell, painting the Filipino fighter not as an athlete, but as a sacrificial lamb brought in to pad the Russians' already inflated record. On the other side of this equation stood Gabriel, a man whose life story could not have been more different from the sterile, high-tech gyms of Moscow, where Volkov was manufactured. Gabriel grew up in the narrow, flooding alleyways of Tonda, where fighting wasn't a sport but a necessity for survival, a daily struggle for bread and dignity. He didn't have nutritionists or sports psychologists. He had a pair of hand-me-down gloves and a heavy bag filled with sand and sawdust hanging from a rusted corrugated roof. While Volkov was mocking him on the internet, Gabriel was running barefoot on the humid streets of Manila, fueled by Panda Sal and the desperate hope that this fight could change his family's destiny. He saw the videos, he heard the insults, and he saw the way the media laughed along with the Russian, but he remained stoic, embodying the Filipino value of haya and humility, refusing to engage in the trash talk. But those close to him saw the change in his eyes. The mockery hadn't discouraged him. It had awakened something ancient and dangerous deep within his soul. The pre-fight press conference was the moment the disrespect crossed the line from professional banter to personal vendetta, creating a clip that would be played on news stations across the globe. Volkov arrived wearing a custom suit, flanked by a massive entourage, while Gabriel sat alone, wearing a simple track jacket with the Philippine flag patch sewn onto the chest. When it was Volkov's turn to speak, he didn't address the media. He turned his chair directly toward Gabriel, pulled out a banana from his pocket, and slid it across the table, making a crude joke about Gabriel's diet and stature. The room went dead silent, the casual racism hanging heavy in the air, but Volkov just threw his head back and laughed, expecting Gabriel to snap or crumble under the humiliation. Instead, Gabriel slowly picked up the fruit, placed it gently to the side, and looked Volkov dead in the eyes with a terrifying calmness, whispering a phrase in Tagalog that the microphones barely picked up. Ong tong najajipit, esse paddlem kamakapit. A desperate man will clutch a knife blade. The weigh-ins were even more volatile, with security guards forced to create a human wall between the two men, though it was entirely Volkov acting as the aggressor. The Russian shoved his forehead into Gabriel's, screaming obscenities and making throat-slashing gestures to the crowd. basking in the boos that rained down from the Filipino fans in attendance. Gabriel stood like a statue, weighing in 2 pounds under the limit, his body lean and scarred, looking significantly smaller than the dehydrated, muscle-bound Russian. Pundits and analysts broke down the matchup immediately after, with 95% of them predicting a first-round submission for Volkov, citing the massive disparity in grappling pedigree. They laughed at the idea of Gabriel's boxing making a difference, joking that he would spend the entire night on his back staring at the arena lights. But they failed to account for the intangible factor, the Puso, heart, that defines Filipino fighting culture, a refusal to accept defeat that defies logic and physics. As fight night arrived, the arena was a cauldron of noise, a mix of Russian chants and the rhythmic, pounding drums of the Filipino contingent who had traveled thousands of miles to support their underdog. When Volkov made his walk to the cage, it was a theatrical production, complete with pyrotechnics and a remix of the Soviet anthem, designed to intimidate and showcase his dominance. He entered the cage and immediately paced around the perimeter, glaring at the audience, looking every bit the invincible giant the posters claimed he was. In stark contrast, Gabriel walked out to a simple folk song, eyes fixed on the canvas, praying silently as he touched his gloves to his forehead. The visual size difference when they met in the center for the referee's instructions was alarming. Volkov looked a full weight class larger after rehydrating, his back muscles rippling as he towered over Gabriel. The referee asked for a touch of gloves, a standard show of sportsmanship, but Volkov spat at Gabriel's feet and turned away, a final act of disrespect that sealed his fate. The bell rang, and Volkov exploded across the cage like a cannonball, looking to end the fight in seconds just to prove his point. He threw a massive overhand right that was merely a distraction, immediately ducking under to secure a double-leg takedown that slammed Gabriel into the canvas with bone-rattling force. The crowd gasped as the Sambo Champion went to work, his heavy hips pinning Gabriel to the floor, suffocating the smaller man with relentless pressure. For the first 3 minutes, it looked exactly like the mismatch everyone predicted. Gabriel was stuck in sands of time, unable to move as Volkov rained down short elbows and hammer fists. Every time Gabriel tried to scramble, Volkov was one step ahead, Matt returning him with violent suplexes that looked like they might snap the Filipino spine. The Russian corner was laughing, shouting at their fighter to break him and send him back to the slums, confident that the end was imminent. However, amidst the mauling, Gabriel was doing something subtle that the cameras missed but veteran fighters recognized. He was surviving, not panicking. While Volkov was expending massive amounts of energy trying to force a finish, Gabriel was making micro-adjustments, keeping his chin tucked, breathing rhythmically, and waiting for the storm to pass. He absorbed punishment that would have knocked out a normal man, taking elbows to the brow that opened up a nasty cut, sending blood trickling into his eye. But he didn't wilt. Instead, he used the blood as lubricant to slip out of a tight headlock, managing to get back to his feet for a split second before being dragged down again. The round ended with Gabriel on his back, his face a mask of red, while Volkov stood over him, flexing his biceps and shouting, "Is that all you have?" The scorecard was clearly 10-8 for the Russian, but as Gabriel walked back to his corner, he didn't look defeated. He looked like he was just getting started. In the corner, Gabriel's coach, an old veteran with missing teeth and a lifetime of wisdom, didn't scream or panic. He simply wiped the blood from Gabriel's eye and said, "He is heavy, but he is breathing hard. He thinks you are broken. Let him think it." Gabriel nodded, taking a deep breath of oxygen, his eyes locking onto Volkov across the cage, who was sitting comfortably, joking with his cornermen and barely listening to advice. This was the trap of arrogance. Volkov believed the fight was already won, that the second round was merely a formality. He had spent the first round trying to humiliate Gabriel using high-energy slams, and now the lactic acid was starting to build in his muscles, a physiological reality that no amount of ego could ignore. When the bell rang for round 2, Volkov stood up a little slower, his mouth slightly open, while Gabriel sprang from his stool, the adrenaline of survival masking his pain. The second round began, and Volkov immediately sought to close the distance again, eager to return to the safety of the grappling exchange. He shot for a takedown, but this time he was a fraction of a second slower, telegraphing the move. Gabriel, anticipating the shot, sprawled violently, his hips hitting the mat with perfect timing, stuffing the Russian's head down. For the first time in the fight, Volkov failed to secure the takedown, and as he stumbled back up, he ate a sharp, stinging leg kick that buckled his lead knee. The sound of shin connecting with thigh echoed through the arena, a cracking whip sound that silenced the Russian fans. Gabriel didn't rush. He circled, staying on the outside, using his superior footwork to create angles, refusing to be a stationary target. He landed another kick, then a stiff jab that snapped Volkov's head back, a signal that the hunter was slowly becoming the hunted. Frustrated by his inability to grab the elusive Filipino, Volkov abandoned his game plan and decided to brawl, trusting his chin and power over Gabriel's technique. He began swinging wild, looping hooks, abandoning the tight, technical Sambo defense he was known for. This was the moment of mockery coming back to haunt him. He didn't respect Gabriel's power, so he didn't fear the counterstrike. He taunted Gabriel, dropping his hands and sticking his chin out, inviting the Filipino to hit him, screaming, "Hit me, little man." It was a foolish, ego-driven display that made the crowd roar, but it was a fatal error against a striker who had spent his life punching above his weight class. Gabriel remained stone-faced, not taking the bait immediately, continuing to chop away at Volkov's legs, turning the Russian's thigh into a bruised mess of purple and black. By the midway point of the second round, the dynamic of the fight had shifted perceptibly. Volkov was breathing heavily through his mouth, his movement laboring under the damage to his legs. The mockery had vanished from his face, replaced by a look of confusion and growing frustration. He managed to clinch Gabriel against the cage, using his weight to lean on him, trying to recover his wind, but Gabriel didn't let him rest. The Filipino fighter worked the body, digging short, vicious hooks into Volkov's liver and ribs, sapping whatever energy remained in the Russian's tank. The crowd, sensing the shift, began to chant Gabriel's name, a low rumble that grew into a roar. The invincible giant was looking human, and the sacrificial lamb was revealing himself to be a wolf. Volkov tried for a trip takedown, but his legs were too weak to drive through, and Gabriel simply shoved him off, resetting the fight to the center of the cage. The end of the second round saw a bizarre scene: Volkov, the champion, retreating, while Gabriel stalked him down. Volkov looked at the clock, desperate for the bell, his arrogance completely stripped away by the reality of a grueling dogfight. Gabriel landed a crisp 1-2 combination, jab cross, that bloodied Volkov's nose, adding insult to injury. When the bell finally rang, Volkov slumped onto his stool, his chest heaving, his coaches frantically pouring water over his head and screaming at him to wake up. Across the cage, Gabriel stood up before the minute rest was even over, bouncing on his toes, the blood on his face looking like war paint. The commentators were losing their minds, shouting that the tide had turned, that the impossible was happening before their eyes. The narrative of the easy fight had been destroyed. Now, it was a war for survival. Round 3, the final round, began with a touch of destiny in the air. Volkov knew he was likely ahead on points due to the first round domination, so his strategy shifted to survival. He just needed to ride out the clock to secure a decision victory. He kept his distance, refusing to engage, circling away and looking at the referee, hoping for a stoppage or a break. But Gabriel knew he needed a finish. Coming from a poor country fighting on foreign soil, he knew the judges would likely favor the champion in a close decision. He had to take the decision out of their hands. He pressed forward with reckless abandon, eating jabs to land power shots, walking through the fire. He cornered Volkov against the fence, unleashing a flurry of punches that forced the Russian to shell up, covering his head with his massive arms. The mockery that started the fight, the banana, the insults, the spitting, flashed through the minds of everyone watching as Volkov cowered against the cage. The bully was being bullied. Gabriel feinted a level change, pretending to go for a takedown, a move that tricked Volkov's exhausted brain. The Russian dropped his hands instinctively to defend his hips, exposing his head for a fraction of a second. That was all Gabriel needed. He uncorked a left hook from hell, a punch that carried the weight of every insult, every hungry night in Tonda, and every sacrifice his family had made. The connection was clean, flush on the jaw, and the sound was like a gunshot. Volkov's eyes rolled back, his legs turned to jelly, and he crumbled to the canvas in slow motion, face planting into the mat with a thud that shook the floorboards. For a heartbeat, there was absolute silence. The Russian crowd was stunned into paralysis, unable to process that their invincible titan had just been flattened by the man they ridiculed. Then chaos erupted. The referee dived in to save the unconscious Volkov, waving his arms to stop the fight, but Gabriel had already stopped. He didn't follow up with unnecessary strikes. He didn't stand over his opponent and taunt him. He simply knelt down in the center of the cage, made the sign of the cross, and wept. The contrast between Volkov's pre-fight arrogance and Gabriel's post-fight humility was a powerful image that was beamed to millions of screens. The underdog had not just won, he had delivered a knockout for the ages, a shot heard around the world that shattered the hierarchy of the division. As the medical team rushed in to attend to Volkov, who remained unconscious for a worrying amount of time, the reality of the upset set in. This wasn't just a lucky punch, it was a systematic dismantling of a bully. Gabriel had weathered the storm, broken the Russians' will, and executed a perfect game plan. When Volkov finally came to, he was confused, trying to wrestle the doctor, unaware that the fight was over. The replay on the giant screen showed the knockout on a loop, the feint, the dropped hands, the hook, the fall. It was a masterpiece of striking, a moment of technical brilliance born from desperation. The camera panned to Volkov's face as he watched his own defeat, the realization dawning on him that his arrogance had cost him everything. The official decision was announced. The winner, by way of knockout, onto the new champion. Gabriel's hand was raised, and the belt was wrapped around his waist, looking almost too big for his frame. He grabbed the microphone, and the crowd, even the Russians, waited with bated breath, expecting him to return the trash talk, to rub salt in the wound. They expected him to say, "I told you so," or to mock Volkov's earlier stunts. But Gabriel, with a swollen eye and a busted lip, looked at the camera and simply said, "This is for my country. Respect to my opponent. We are all fighting for something." He walked over to the groggy Volkov, bowed, and offered a handshake. Volkov, broken and humiliated, hesitated, then slowly extended his hand, the ultimate sign of submission not to force, but to character. The aftermath of the fight was instantaneous and global. The video of the knockout trended #1 worldwide within minutes. Title: "The Bully Gets Slept." Internet sleuths dug up the clips of Volkov's mockery, creating side-by-side compilations of his arrogance versus his unconscious body, turning him into a meme of hubris. But more importantly, Gabriel became an overnight legend. In the Philippines, traffic stopped. People poured into the streets banging pots and pans, celebrating not just a sports victory, but a validation of their struggle. The story resonated because it was universal. The quiet, hard-working man standing up to the loud, entitled oppressor. It was a real-life movie script, proving that in the cage, money and hype cannot save you from the truth of a well-placed left hook. In the days following the fight, the contrast in trajectories for the two fighters was stark. Volkov went into hiding, his reputation in tatters, dropped by sponsors who wanted nothing to do with the bully image now that the aura of invincibility was gone. He released a short, text-only statement apologizing for his behavior, admitting that he had underestimated his opponent and lost his way. It was a hard lesson learned in the most public way possible. On the other hand, Gabriel returned home a national hero. He was greeted at the airport by thousands, given a ticker-tape parade, and even received a call from the president. Yet, amidst the flashbulbs and the newfound fame, Gabriel was photographed the very next morning back in his old gym, sweeping the floors and hitting the same rusted heavy bag, proving that money had changed his bank account, but not his soul. The fight world analyzed the bout for months, breaking down the technical failure of Volkov. They pointed out that his sambo was elite, but his ego had made him sloppy. He had fallen in love with his own hype, believing he could tank shots and disrespect the fundamentals of defense. It served as a grim reminder to every up-and-coming fighter: respect the game, or the game will humble you. Coaches used the fight as a case study, showing their students that hard work beats talent when talent refuses to work hard. The image of Volkov mocking Gabriel with the banana became a symbol of premature celebration, a warning against counting your chickens before they hatch, or in this case, counting your victim before he's knocked out. Gabriel's victory also shone a light on the often overlooked talent pool in Southeast Asia. Suddenly, scouts were flocking to the gyms in Manila, looking for the next Gabriel, realizing that hunger and poverty can forge diamonds that high-tech facilities cannot replicate. The narrative changed from "Russians are invincible" to "anyone can be beaten." It democratized the sport again, stripping away the mystique of the undefeated record. Gabriel showed that a record is just a number, but fighting spirit is a force of nature. He proved that you don't need the best shoes to run the fastest, you just need the strongest will to keep running when your lungs are burning. The rivalry, however, didn't end there. Rumors of a rematch began to swirl almost immediately. Promoters smelled money, knowing that a redemption storyline for Volkov or a validation storyline for Gabriel would sell millions of pay-per-views. Volkov, to his credit, emerged from his seclusion a changed man. He fired his yes-men entourage, moved his training camp to a secluded cabin in the mountains, and went back to basics. He stopped posting on social media, stopped the trash talk, and focused entirely on the art of combat. He publicly stated, "I deserve to lose. I became something I hated. Gabriel taught me a lesson I needed to learn." This admission of guilt made the potential rematch even more compelling. It wasn't just good versus evil anymore. It was about forgiveness and growth. Gabriel welcomed the rematch, not out of arrogance, but out of financial necessity and competitive drive. "If he wants to fight, we fight," Gabriel said, shrugging his shoulders. "But he must know, the man he fought last time is gone. I am better now." The psychological dynamic had flipped. Volkov was now the hungry challenger with something to prove, and Gabriel was the champion with everything to lose. The build-up to the second fight was somber, respectful, and intense. There were no bananas, no insults, just two warriors acknowledging that they were about to enter the abyss together once more. The world waited with bated breath, wondering if Volkov's transformation was genuine or if Gabriel truly had his number. When the rematch finally happened a year later, it was a completely different fight. It was a tactical chess match, a grueling 5-round war where neither man gave an inch. Volkov didn't make mistakes. He fought with discipline. Gabriel didn't rely on a Hail Mary punch. He showed improved wrestling defense and cardio. It went to the judges' scorecards, a split decision that could have gone either way. Regardless of who raised their hand that night, the story had already been written in the first fight. The moment of the mockery and the shock had transcended the sport. It became a parable, a modern-day fable about the dangers of hubris. Reflecting on the event, it is fascinating how a single sporting event can capture the imagination of the world. It wasn't about the technique, though the technique was beautiful. It was about the justice of the outcome. We all have a Volkov in our lives, a boss, a bully, a system that tells us we are too small, too poor, or too weak to succeed. When Gabriel landed that left hook, he struck a blow for everyone who has ever been underestimated. He showed us that the giants are only as tall as their knees are strong, and when you chop the legs, they fall just like the rest of us. The shock wasn't that the Russian lost. The shock was realizing how fragile the illusion of superiority really is. The legacy of that night lives on in gyms across the Philippines and Russia. In Manila, young kids mimic Gabriel's hook, dreaming of gold. In Moscow, young Sambo practitioners are taught to bow to their opponents before and after the match, with Volkov's defeat cited as the reason why. The sport evolved, the culture shifted, and the level of respect between nations actually increased. The violence of the cage had, paradoxically, birthed a newfound understanding. It proved that mutual respect is the only sustainable foundation for competition, and that disrespect is a weakness, a crack in the armor that a skilled opponent will eventually exploit. Ultimately, the story of the Russian Sambo Champion and the Filipino fighter is a testament to the unpredictable nature of human conflict. You can measure reach, weight, and VO2 max, but you cannot measure the size of a man's heart. You cannot quantify the desperation of a man fighting for his family's next meal. Volkov had the science, but Gabriel had the cause. And in the end, the cause provided the fuel for the miracle. It serves as a permanent reminder to the world: be humble in victory, gracious in defeat, and never, ever judge a fighter by the patch of dirt he was born on. So, the next time you see a loudmouth celebrating before the finish line, or a giant mocking the little guy, remember Gabriel Magtanggol and Dmitri Volkov. Remember the silence of a crowd when the giant fell. Remember that the loudest noise isn't the trash talk. It's the sound of the underdog's hand being raised while the world watches in disbelief. It is a story that will be told for generations, a story of blood, sweat, and the undeniable power of the human spirit.